Okay, I think we'll get started. I'm Jim Raymer. I'm the Chief of the Toronto Police Service and the current President of LINC. It's really my pleasure to be here today. We have come together to reassert our commitment to preventing victimization before it occurs. And when it inevitably does, to having robust processes and professionals in place to support victims. Being here in New York, particularly at this time of year, is really a visceral reminder that these are more than just words. And this is why, as a community, we continue to come together to learn from each other and to never allow our resolve to waver. And your presence here today shows your commitment to this cause. Our last panel of the day is Leadership in the Aftermath of Mass Tragedy. Leadership is critical in the aftermath of tragedy. In this session, panelists will share lessons learned in the aftermath of the shootings in Newtown, Las Vegas, and other tragedies. The discussion will provide today's leaders with important considerations to help prepare them to face new challenges. We've listened to a number of panels today, excellent panelists, and this will be no different. Your moderator this afternoon is Heather Cartwright, retired Director of the Office of Justice for Victims of Overseas Terrorism, U.S. Department of Justice, and founding member of Invictum. Our panelists this afternoon are Colonel Dan Stebbins, retired Colonel at the Connecticut State Police, and he was the commander at Sandy Hook. Kevin McMahill, retired Under Sheriff and incoming Clark County Sheriff, Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. And Kevin, it's so good to see you back.
Thanks, sir.
And Dean Haydon, retired Senior National Coordinator of the UK Counter-Terrorism Policing Network and the immediate past president of LINC. Heather?
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth panel. I think the third panel we just heard from really laid good groundwork for what we're going to talk about now. As was mentioned, my name is Heather Cartwright, and I am just retired from the U.S. Department of Justice, where I spent 32 years working on victims' rights and services. And the last 13 years I spent in the National Security Division, working on setting up a program to assist Americans who are victims of terrorism in overseas attacks. So you can see that brings together exactly what we're talking about here. And I am very proudly a founding member of Invictum, which was really brought together in about 2016 to bring all the experts, some of whom you just heard in the previous panel, to bring experts together to really improve the support to victims in terrorism cases. So one of the themes of this conference is the turbulent times that we live in, and we certainly heard from the first panel about the threats that still exist. And it was a reminder that we all need to be prepared for this type of tragedy happening in any community. We also have heard a common theme throughout all the panels of the lack of trust that we currently have in institutions, including law enforcement. But we also heard some hopeful elements, for example, with the Canova panel about how we can build trust even when it's initially lost. But it's much better to build that trust from the beginning than to come in, 20, 30, 40 years later and try to build that trust with the victim families. So given that background, we have three law enforcement leaders with us on this panel, each of whom have handled at least one, if not many, major mass tragedy cases. And it's our hope that the lessons learned by these leaders can be instrumental for the future attacks which we need to prepare for. And I think we'll start with Colonel Dan Stebbins. If you could give us a little bit, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your experience.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here today. As said, I'm Dan Stebbins. I'm from your neighboring state of Connecticut, the only place I've ever lived. We've had a 06 for the zip code. In other words, I've always been in Connecticut. That's what happens when you leave high school and you join the state police and you have to do your whole career there. So basically, that's what I've done. I worked my way up through all the different ranks along the way. My goal was always, like it had been in sports, I wanted to be the go-to guy. So I was trying to build up my resume so that whenever something happened, they would send me. And it happened a lot over the years. I retired from the state police after 35 years, and I went to work for the U.S. Attorney's Office. And in that case, I was a terrorism investigator, primarily for financing that was being done here in the U.S. To support terrorism. After about 5.5 years there, I got called from the governor's office, and they asked me to come back to the state police to run it. New party was in, and they were doing a clean slate, so I was the go-to guy on that one. They brought me back. And it was great. It was probably the worst. First 3 years were probably the worst years of my life. My brother died at 61. My sister died at 56. And I said, what is going on here? And then Newtown hit on top of it. So I had a few years there that were difficult. I'm going to talk a little bit later on about personally how that affected me. I am a post-traumatic stress person who had to be treated and go through therapy. And I swear by it. It was excellent for me. And I'd like to talk about some of the things we weren't prepared for. We'll go over some of those. And some of the things that worked. And obviously, in all these cases, there's always a few that didn't work. So we'll spend some time on that. And then I'll share a story that someone wants me to share later on. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Kevin McMahill. I retired about 18 months ago from Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department as the undersheriff, which those of you who don't know what an undersheriff is, it's not physically under the sheriff, in case you were wondering, but I like to have a little bit of fun with these things, right? But that's the #2 person in charge of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. I had a 30-year career. 2 of those years were with the Denver Police Department as well. Like the colonel, I really worked all over the organization. I wanted to be the top, but the reason I retired was the current sheriff was going to run for a 3rd term, and there wasn't much else left for me to go do. And so I went to the private sector, and I was working for a company that did correctional health care. I got to do that for about 3 or 4 months. Really great gig, paid me a lot of money. I flew around on a private jet, had no stress. My phone never went off at night or on the weekends, and I was living pretty good. And then the sheriff told me he was going to run for governor and wanted me to run for sheriff. So I jumped right off that ledge and entered the combat sport of politics. And I got elected in the primary election with an overwhelming almost 60%. So I take office for the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and the Clark County Sheriff January 4th of this coming year. So that's kind of who I am. I'll talk to you a little bit after Dean does his introduction around specifically the 1 October event and where it is that we're going with this panel.
Thanks, Kevin. Well, I can't beat that one, can I? So I'm not going for political office in any way, shape or form. So Dean Haydon, I was a Deputy Assistant Commissioner in the Metropolitan Police in London, but I was also the Senior National Coordinator for Counter-Terrorism across the UK, and also responsible for international operations overseas. So obviously looking after British interests overseas if there was an attack involving, like I say, British interests overseas. So 35 years in policing, the last kind of 15, almost 17 years within counter-terrorism. I got to obviously this year and retired in July. So unlike the previous 2, I'm in that kind of transition. I'm actually chilling out at the moment and travelling the world. So come to New York for now. I'm going to go and work under Kevin in Las Vegas as he's under sheriff at some stage. So yeah, I'm in the chilling out kind of mood, if you like. So hence I thought I'd come to New York and talk to this audience around some of my experiences. When I look at my kind of term in office, if you like, as the Senior National Coordinator, and some of the things I'm going to talk about, I've lived through the year of 2017, which across the UK, we saw really one of the worst years on record for terrorist attacks. So we saw 5 attacks literally across the country, one after the other. The very next year then we had the Salisbury poisoning, so the Russian GRU agents that travelled to London and then ultimately ended up in Salisbury, responsible for the Novichok poisonings of the Skripals. And of course that's an ongoing investigation with the public inquiry coming up probably next year. And then following that, 2019, 20, 21, 22, up until my departure, we saw a number of terrorist attacks, again, across the UK, mostly perpetrated by lone actor type individuals. So rather interestingly, listening to the panel this morning, the threat has completely changed for all of us, I think. You know, we've gone from, I know we've spoken a lot about 9/11, but directed attacks involving kind of big organisations, call them organisations, but big groups like Al-Qaeda, for instance, to somebody who's kind of, you know, got their, if you like, plan in their head, and they're really difficult to tackle. And that's the new challenge, I think, for all of us. All the way up to the latest attack that we had, which was an attack, again, against our democracy, of the attacker Sir David Amess, one of our elected MPs, very tragically murdered by, again, a lone actor inspired by, certainly, an ISIS ideology. So, having lived through a lot of that, some of the leadership kind of lessons and some of the issues we're going to come on to, that's the kind of context.
Okay, so the first question is, why don't we start right in the moment of crisis, when you're first discovering that you may have a large-scale event on your hands, a large-scale attack. What are some of the priorities, and how do you make sure that you keep a victim-focused approach in those first few crises, and then how that continues on through time? So Dan, I'm going to go to you first.
Okay, thank you. First, I want to plug somebody, and that was the 911 Commission that was mentioned earlier. They did a lot of work following what happened here in New York, and some of the spillover to that was they created the National Public Safety Broadband Network, which is pretty much unique to the United States, where we have a phone system now that works across the country because of them. AT&T's FirstNet division is managing that for the United States, and I work for them. They actually came looking and said, "We've seen you talk before. You'll help us grow." So there's good things that came out of the 911 Commission, that being one of them. I'll start with my trip to Newtown. I was 73 miles away at a funeral for another trooper, and on my way there, I was not able to get communications from anybody. What's going on? They called me out of a funeral. It has to be something important. And it was through a text, and said, "You just have to get there." They didn't really know why. That's a real communications failure that we've all experienced in our careers, and it's still out there if you're not taking advantage of certain systems. Well, en route there, I was finally able to get someone to tell me that there was bodies in the front lobby of the school. Sandy Hook School ended up having 20 children killed and 6 adults, but there was 2 bodies in the foyer, and the person that called it in said it looks like a domestic. So for 73 miles, I was under the impression it was a domestic. That's how poor communications was at the time. I got called from the governor, from the U.S. attorney, and others that I'm personally friends with and worked with for years, asking me what's going on. Why are we sending all these people, et cetera? And I said, I'm only good as the information I have, and right now it's a domestic of 2 people. And as I'm sure you remember, it's much worse than that ever could have been. When I got on the scene, I ran into something I'd never seen before. I ran into many law enforcement and fire and EMS people who were in a daze. They were suffering post-traumatic stress to the point where they would walk out in front of cars if you didn't deal with them and steer them in the right direction and bring them back into some sort of fold that you could give them some privacy, maybe. That big rock in Saving Private Ryan, give them a place to go cry. And I said, how can this doesn't fit what I'm coming to, what I was driving to and what I responded to. And believe it or not, one of the first things we had to do was stand down the police department and the fire department. They were such a mess, and it was catchy. It was getting bigger, but you're not normally going to a scene and finding that your people are the ones that are the first things that you notice are different, because they're trying to talk to you and they can't because of the tears. So we did right away. I hadn't picked up my radio, told I need more people here because there's an issue of taking over the case at this point in time. Any of our cases that we've done, you sometimes get the school police, you get the local police, you get the municipal police, maybe the state police are coming in and take it, maybe the feds are coming in. To the outside world, that looks like so confusing, and it looks like you don't know what you're doing, and some of it's accurate, to make that happen. So you're going to have a terrible first response when you get there. This is where leadership becomes a big role. There are going to be people that want to be leaders who can't be, and others that are going to want to just be the person that deal with the cameras. I would recommend to anybody in the room, if you're ever involved in one of these cases, is you pick a good PIO, someone that's solid. You tell everybody in the media. I was the first one to speak to the media, and I basically told them, Paul Vance was my PIO at the time, if it doesn't come out of Paul's voice box, it is not official. He is the only person that can talk about this case in an official manner. That took care of a lot of things. All my staff that wanted to talk, no. All the police departments that wanted to talk, no. Fire departments, everybody else. They could talk, but they were told right up front, the only official stuff comes from one person. That will help you in many, many ways. If you look right back to Uvalde, you can see that it was a mess down there with everybody talking, because they're going to play you against each other, the media. They're very good at it. Next thing I noticed, I had a lot of families hanging around. They hadn't claimed their child. This happened so fast that many of the children had been claimed by their parents at the school before some of the emergency responders were even there. So you had a very dangerous scene. You had a lot of people with arms out, guns out, et cetera, and then other people that are pretty excited because they want to get their child out of there. It was apparent that we needed to have a family liaison officer for all those families right away, because they were looking for answers and they were going to the wrong places, and they didn't really know who to go to because of so many agencies being there. Family liaison officer happened at the scene. I basically said, I need 26 people here. I need 26 troopers to assign to these families so that we can use those troopers to get the information from the families and to give them information. The last thing you want is for them to get it through the media, because you're getting somebody else's spin. You're not getting the information right through either myself, Paul, and right to their troopers. That worked out very well for us. I stole that. It's not like I had a big idea, but I'll ask the question. Many, many years ago, a plane went down in the Everglades in Florida. Every person died on that plane. What was the name of the airline?
ValueJet.
ValueJet, you've heard me before. That's why nobody knows who they are. That was their last flight ever. They were out of business. You don't want to be ValueJet. In other words, you need to be working these cases so that you survive too, and you take care of your people and the victims' families. The Family Liaison Officer program started out within an hour. They were there when all the families were notified of the death of their child. That's a role you never want to have. I had it that day. I took it that day. I'd been through it before. And people are going to look at you in that town or wherever that was like the Grim Reaper for the rest of your time, if you ever go back to that town. I find myself still to this day avoiding it, because if I walked into one of their shopping malls or stuff like that, you will see people point, that's the guy that told them that they lost their child or they weren't going to claim them. Not an easy burden to carry. I would not recommend it for everybody, but at the same time, who do you give it to? Who do you give it to? You can't give it to someone that works there every day, in my mind. And in my case, the governor wanted to do it, and I told him, no, no, no. You want to run for re-election or something like that? You don't want them seeing the Grim Reaper on TV. So that was another title I had for a while. We had media coming from everywhere, which all these gentlemen did the same thing. And they came from all over the world, as was mentioned earlier. And some of them are very polite and work very well with you. And some are just the opposite of that. And they will try to sneak through people's backyards to get a statement. They'll lay in wait for them. It was embarrassing to see that we have human beings that are out there that won't give these people some privacy during their time of need. But we had to deal with them. The family liaisons, when I assigned them, I said, do whatever the family needs to do. This is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life, and we're going to make it as easy as it possibly can be for these families. There's no way you can make the pain go away, but you can keep it from multiplying because the media is all over you, or whatever else comes along with this. And then you, of course, get the Alex Jones people to come into the world. You just can't make this up. It couldn't have got worse. We had a lot of failures that day with the school system. Those are for a different class, obviously. Today is taking care of your people, taking care of your victims' families. Those failures hurt me, and it hurt everybody that I worked with. You can't go to a scene like that and then say to yourself, we didn't save anybody. Nobody. There was nothing we did that saved a life. There was probably a few things we could have done better that maybe would have saved a life, but the technology wasn't there at the time. In other words, state police couldn't talk to local police couldn't talk to us, we couldn't talk to fire, we couldn't talk to EMS. All of us had disparate systems, so that's why I like what the 911 Commission came up with as far as this national broadband system. That in itself is a huge difference, and now it's been expanded so that the people in the school can have the phones on FirstNet and talk to you direct. They can actually hit one button and talk to the superintendent, the principal, police, fire, EMS, all at the same time, the people in the school. We had people in the school who were trying to call, just like you saw in Florida and several other states. They were trying to call 911, and their calls didn't go through because of congestion on the phone systems. I won't ask anybody, but I can see you. If you don't have a phone in the room, would you please stand up? And I think everybody's got a phone. I say that because right now, if you're in the areas that I work in, there's probably 2 or 3 people sitting in the dispatch center, the 911 PSAP, who are taking calls. If we all dial 911 right now, how many calls are going to go through to that unit? 2 or 3. So we still got a long ways to go. Absolutely, we have a long ways to go with communications, and it's getting better. And that's why, I like this new system, because it gives you priority. We are allowing school people now to be on that same phone system that the police, fire, and EMS are on. Why? Those are our kids. We should have the best to protect them and to get the messages out. So that's really what I ran into up front. There's a lot more here that I would like to offer, but I want to pass the baton to the other gentleman here.
Thanks. Can you cue those slides up for me? So just in the interest of time, I thought we were going to have plenty of time, and I watched this ticker in front of us. I realized it goes a lot faster than you think. And so I'm not going to cover a lot of the same things the Colonel did, but suffice it to say, for the most part, we had the exact same issues, with the exception of the family liaison officer. And part of that is the extent of and the magnitude of our attack. And so I wanted to just give you a couple of slides and a video that we've put together, and think about it from this perspective. I like to simplify things because it helps people understand something. But if you take and ask people what an active shooter is, everybody has a little bit different version of what an active shooter is. To me, it very simply is this. Since Columbine, you have a box. Whatever that box is, could be a casino, a movie theater, a church, a school, whatever it is. If there's active killing in the box, cops go and stop the killing. That's it. That's all active shooters is. My box had 22,000 people in it enjoying a country concert. 32 floors up, a maniac starts to shoot into that crowd. As he continues to shoot, you see all those dots that are running as far and as fast as they can to get away from the killing field. So as we move forward into this, we're actually moving into a place where there's no box to go to. All of our victims have gone as quickly as they can away from there. 22,000 victims sitting in there. 58 people died that day. 422 people were shot with an AR-15 round. And 850 total people were injured. So all of the training that we had moving into 1 October, starting at Columbine and paying attention to the lessons learned from every other mass tragedy that we have, here we are dealt another hand where really the only people left were the 37 that were still laying on the field. And bodies everywhere. And so as we move into the next piece and part of this, here's what I would want you to consider, because I'm going to be very candid with you. When you talk about a victim-centric approach, I didn't do it. And I'm a trauma-informed leader. I'm a past president of Linked. I have heard Sue and Mary and so many others talk about the focus on the victims. But I want you to tell me at what point, if you were a leader, as you were dealing with this, I had no idea how many people were shot. In fact, back then we still had HIPAA laws, and then along came COVID and HIPAA laws went away. But that was the excuse, that nobody could tell me how many people were hospitalized in 13 different hospitals, what their injuries were. It took 6 or 7 days for me to actually get that information. And talk about trauma, coming in every day after having a couple hours worth of sleep and seeing that number of injured increase. Relatively quickly, we knew how many were dead. where to find them all, that was very difficult. But for hours and hours on end, we had no idea of the magnitude of this event. And let me just tell you, as you think about victims, here's what, as I'm the incident commander sitting there trying to deal with this is a portion of the information that came in to the command post. I hit it a couple times.
Division, go ahead.
Hey, Chief, we're getting reports from bystanders that they saw somebody go into an RV directly across the street from where we're at, wearing fatigues and a black duffel bag.
Lion 6, be advised, we're getting reports on Mandalay Bay, the top of Mandalay Bay at the bar. We currently have another active shooter up there. I have reports that there's an active shooter at New York, New York. And shots heard from Hooters.
We have reports of active shooters now at Hakkasan and New York, New York. I have not confirmed that.
Also getting reports that shots are being fired at MGM as well. Shots fired at MGM. We now have report of an active shooter at the Tropicana, active shooter at the Tropicana.
Command from North Branch Emergency Traffic. We have people on the roof of the Tropicana, at least 2 people on the roof of the Tropicana.
Emergency traffic, shots fired in the Tropicana. Shots fired in the Tropicana.
Command from North Branch, we're getting people evacuating out of the Excalibur reporting that there's a fire in there. Chief Blackburn's receiving reports of shots fired in the Planet Hollywood, and I see strobes going off inside of the Mandalay. Chief Blackburn just came in here. He's reporting shots fired at Caesars now.
Be advised, we are currently receiving reports of an active shooter at McCarran Airport. Repeat, active shooter at McCarran Airport. And be advised, we're getting reports on the 34th floor of Mandalay Bay. There's been an explosion in the 32nd, 33rd, and 34th floor on fire.
Over there.
Command, we just had a backpack show up unattended right where EMS branch is set up at Alibaba and Giles. We're relocating from the area.
Command operations. Also, we're getting reports of hostages being held currently at New York, New York.
Emergency Traffic, Force Protection 6 is reporting shots fired at the New York, New York.
Sorry, I still get a little nervous when I watch that stuff, but that stuff comes in over the course of a couple of hours. And what I want you to think about from that perspective, though, is that these are all reliable reporters that are giving us this information. These are police officers, these are firefighters, these are task force people that are out there clearing hotels that are saying shots are being fired. So we believed every single bit of this information as it was coming in. And so, you know, I want to talk a little bit about some leadership decision making about this, because now, if you look where we're at Mandalay Bay, we're kind of at the bottom of the screen, and this is all kind of marching back up Las Vegas Boulevard. And each one, as it goes, it's basically the next casino, the next casino. And so my wife and I had actually taken our kids up to the Strip that night. We hadn't been there in forever. We take them to see Blue Man Group next door at the Luxor. And we had literally driven by that corner from where the shooting had happened about 15 minutes prior. We just got home, tucked our kids into bed, and I got the notification, turned the radio on, jumped in the car, and went back to the command post. Had no idea of the magnitude. I could hear the machine gun fire over the radio as officers were keying the mics. And so we get there, and it's just absolute chaos. But we all been trained in what we call incident command system. An incident command system is very specific about, you know, joint command, having, you know, all of these different things set up and all of those pieces and parts. And you have a staging area, and we have hundreds of officers from a variety of different places, and they go from the staging area at the direction of the commander to go to these particular locations. And so as each one of these came in, I'm sitting there taking a group of 10, 20 guys and sending them downrange to go try to deal with that. Well, you know what it's like to get through 22,000 people that are clogging the streets. It takes me an hour to resolve the first one. So all of these things keep coming. So I made a decision in incident command that, you know, I've talked to a few firefighters in the past that were a bit critical of it, but I made a decision, rather than to have all these officers sitting in the staging area, I made a decision to forward deploy teams of 25 to every single property on Las Vegas Boulevard and in the downtown corridor. Because I'm sure some of you have seen this presentation before, but what every single one of those incidents was, with one or two exceptions, the bag being dropped in front of the firefighters while they're doing medical, but every single one of those was one of those 22,000 people making it to another location and showing up, shot, covered in blood. And so you imagine your wife and you were walking outside of the Bellagio and here comes a carload of people that are shot to hell. Everybody's calling 911 and saying, there's another shooting over here. And that's what all of these things were. People were terrified. We found them 12 hours later hiding in boiler rooms and places. We had to search every one of those people, or every one of those casinos from top to bottom. And so as you make some of these decisions in a leadership position, you always wonder whether or not it's the right decision. But a lot of times, and especially when you're going against established incident command, one of the things that you have to do is you just have to make that decision, and you have to live with it. And, you know, there's so many various people that want to get involved, and want to, you know, we had people that own tanks that were driving down to Las Vegas Boulevard in a tank, and, you know, we think there's a whole new invasion going on. We had armed people, because Nevada's it's still the wild, wild west, that you can carry weapons and do all these kind of things. People just showing up with guns in all of these places. And so the point I'm making to you about all of this is sometimes when you're in those leadership positions and you have such an extraordinary circumstance, sometimes you just are going to have to make decisions that have not yet been written about. They have not really been fully vetted. They have not been talked about. And I'll talk about a few lessons learned here in a few minutes. But part of what allowed us to be so successful that day, thinking about 422 people being shot with an AR-15 round, was we made some difficult decisions in Las Vegas between the Clark County Fire Department and the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department to let our guards down and to actually work together, to train together. But let's be honest about this. We've had this argument with police and fire for years about fire waits in the cold zone, where the cops are in the warm zone, in the hot zone, and then once we can protect them, they'll come in. But they wouldn't come in until there was a certain level. So now, what happens when you have police officers and firefighters that are in the hot zone when the shooting occurs? Yet we've never trained them, we've never developed them, we've never talked to them. Firefighters don't know about cover and concealment, and so those are all things that we dealt with that particular day. I'll throw over to you. I'm getting the hook already, so. You didn't even have to stand up. Just say, shut up. I got it.
I wanted to give Dean a chance to give us a little background about the initial response, but I know there's a couple of big issues that we wanted to specifically talk about, so I want to make sure we get there.
I suppose just to answer your question, I will link it back to Kevin, what Kevin's saying. If I look at the immediate priority absolutely is public safety and neutralising the threat, whatever you're dealing with, same as Kevin was talking about here. And if I just give one example of the many terrorist attacks that we've been through, again, if I go back to 2017, the Westminster attack. So that was the first attack we had in 2017. And if you're not familiar with that one, that's a lone actor who is in a hire car, drives over Westminster Bridge, knocks people off the bridge. One victim falls into the river and dies subsequently. He continues over the bridge, crashes into the wall of the Palace of Westminster, gets out armed with a knife, enters the Palace of Westminster, and he attacks one of our police officers and murders one of our police officers, and then he's shot dead by two protection officers who are plainclothes officers armed actually within the palace itself, protecting our MPs. So on the back of that, 6 people dead in total. That includes obviously one of our police officers and includes the individual himself. Now, it sounds fairly straightforward when I explain such as that, but linking it back to Kevin's what he was saying there in his presentation, actually, if I pose the question in those early stages around what are you actually dealing with? When we went back and listened to the emergency calls, so obviously the budget I have compared to Kevin, he's got a flashy presentation, I'm going to talk mine through. But when I look at our emergency calls at the time for what I've just described, we had different reports of a road traffic collision. We had reports of 1 attacker in the car, 2 attackers in the car, 3 attackers in the car, a combination of all of that, but this time they're armed with knives, armed with guns, And then the one that took up most of our time was that there was 2 attackers in there. One of them actually got out, was wearing a suicide backpack, and he had disappeared down one of the streets into central London. So for a number of hours, we had a manhunt going on looking for a guy with a suicide bomb in his backpack. Never existed. So when you come back to kind of leadership and command and control, what are you actually dealing with? Are you dealing with a terrorist attack? Are you dealing with a road traffic incident? Are you dealing with somebody who's got mental health problems? Are you dealing with a crime? It could be something completely different. So actually, in those initial stages, that's why I come back to the fact that our absolute priority is public safety and neutralising the threat. Understand what you're dealing with. You know, you need the best intelligence picture. You need to decipher all that kind of what I call a fog of war in the initial stages, and then start making your decisions. And you need as many assets there as possible. And again, I'll be pretty frank and blunt, Sue, same as Kevin, that you come back to the question of the victim-focused approach. Actually, your initial stages, your decisions are around public safety and neutralising the threat.
Well, and then I'm going to ask you, once you've neutralized the threat and you've got that figured out, is your job done?
No,
is that it?
Absolutely not. No, that's the whole start of the process. The initial response, you know, is going to involve, you know, back in the UK, it's going to involve mostly uniform resources. As you know, most of the cops in the UK are not armed. So we'll get as many armed assets as we can to the scene if it's that kind of threat. We'll be neutralising the threat, and then, of course, we've got a crime scene. So, again, if you equate what Kevin spoke about with Las Vegas, you've got a massive crime scene. You know, so you're now into your kind of evidence forensic retrieval, and that's when your victim-focused approach actually starts kicking in. So for us, in the UK, we have family liaison coordinators and family liaison officers. They'll be engaging with the families. We'll be doing the victim kind of the various kind of facilities that we set up and support mechanisms that we put in place. That's going to take some time, absolutely take some time, and that's when the investigation actually starts for us.
We've talked in this conference quite a bit about trust issues and the importance of communication. And we've also talked about the circles of victims and who's a victim. Could you, and I'm going to throw this out to the whole panel, can you talk to us about who is a victim and who is affected by one of these attacks? And then how do you best communicate with the different audiences, being the public, the media, the actual people who are the family members of the killed, the survivors, people who are present but maybe not physically injured? And then finally, your first responders, your staff. And so how do you communicate with all of those groups to try to build trust and to do it in a victim-centric way?
Well, I guess I should start again. We did create the Family Liaison Officer program on scene. It had never been done before in the United States that we're aware of. Did some research after the fact to find out who had training on this, being that we were already trying it, and the UK was the only one that had it. So we adopted that, and we train for that now with our people, because I put a lot of people in a position where they really didn't have a lot of experience. And they stayed with those families for 8 days. The deal was that they were going to stay with them for the first 8 days, or however long it took to put all those young children in a gravesite, or the adults. So it took 6 full days of funerals, and just getting ready for 6 funerals, 28 funerals, that's a huge undertaking, especially when the world's watching and there's a lot of people there. So I had more people I was bringing in on this case than I ever imagined. I had the president coming, and when the president comes, you close down the interstates, both ways. If it's the vice president, you only have to close down half the highway. But again, we had the president coming in, we had the attorney general coming in. We had tour buses coming from New York that were driving through our scene, you know, up the main road. And those kind of things make my blood get a little warm. And so we had to stop things that were happening that you never would have imagined they would be coming. And the tour bus never came back. I'll just leave it at that. My people, I could see it in them. I could see it in myself, some more than others, depending on who had been in the scene. One of the first orders given was nobody goes in. I don't care who it is, nobody goes in. And I gave that to one of the commanders, and that's what his job was. It was nobody got in there because it was only going to damage that person. I wish I had never gone in there. And along with that, if you don't mind, I'm going to do the post-traumatic stress piece. I was doing presentations like this around the country for a few months, and I knew I was in trouble. I was having a hard time getting through it. I would get choked up. The colonel can't be crying in front of everybody. But I was getting through it, but I knew it was eating me alive. And I had a real big sign, but I missed it. It was the week after Sandy Hook. It was a Friday night. I was going to my youngest, she's 8th grade grad. She had a solo dance and a solo song for her school. So you got to be dad too. You got to go still be with your family. It was the first time in a week that I was actually just dad for the next hour. I sat down in the front row. My wife was landing planes up front, to get me to sit down there. My mother, my in-laws, my other kids were all there. And I sat down, and I can tell you exactly what happened. I put my feet down, I put my elbows down, and I put my face in my hands. And I was thanking the Lord. Not that I'm a real religious person, but I had to thank somebody for the fact that I could just be out of this arena for the next hour. I looked down, and there was a puddle forming between my shoes, and I was like, what's going on here? What's going on with me? And I realized the tears were not dripping, they were running out of me. My heart started to bounce around like I thought I was having a heart attack. I went to the edge of the theater, back out the way I came in, and the guy that was, Willie, did all the lawn mowing at the school and took care of everything else. I went by Willie because my daughter would work for him during the summer, and I says, Willie, if I'm not back in 15 minutes, dial 911. He goes, yeah, Colonel, okay. I said, I mean it. And I went out, I walked in the rain until the 4th grade class came out. And then I went back into the auditorium. The part I skipped was what keyed it. They opened up the curtains, and here was all the 1st graders going to do their first Christmas carol sitting on the bleachers. Still hurts. Still hurts. They were all dressed in their reds and whites, and just the same kind of day that we had at the school, because that was their holiday festival, the day that the shooter was there. And I knew then that I was in trouble. And I was thinking to myself, there's another 100 people like me, easily, that are like this, because their wives were calling all the way through the chain of command, calling me direct, saying, you got to do something. And these were people on the job 20, 25 years. You could send them to anything, and they never had a problem. I had a lot of problems. When I first came on the job, as I got promoted to sergeant, I was doing this one area that I worked like 100 deaths a year, because it was mostly elderly. They were mostly untimely deaths, but there was still a lot of other tragedies. And none of that stuff bothered me. And they used to call me the Iceman. That was the nickname, because I was the only sergeant around that lived in the troop area who was around at nights that they could call out of the house. Well, I can tell you, that guy at my daughter's dance recital and song, he melted. I knew I was in a lot of trouble. And now I recognize the fact that we had to have another system. We didn't have it in place. I didn't have a system that I could call upon to help me. And so I looked for months, and it wasn't until I was doing a presentation somewhere, and a guy walked up to me, and he says, I can see in you what was wrong with me. And he handed me his business card, and it said EMDR on the back. And that's what I ended up going through. 45 minutes of EMDR, and I won't say the Iceman was back, but his twin was there. And I was back on my game. But I was saying to myself, I've got to get this message out. So I sat in an audience like this, all cops, all people that were there, and I said, look, nobody wanted to sign on the paperwork, meaning you're going to be treated because you're being treated for a mental defect or injury or something like that. And that can hurt you as you apply for jobs later on if you've been treated that way. I got them to work with me. They said, you give us a control group, we'll do it all for nothing, because we've never been able to have a successful control group where they've all done the same thing. I never knew who went. 3 years later, I had to go back and clean up a few slides that were still bothering me because I notified all the families. I forgot to go through that piece. I got tired of being looked at as the Grim Reaper. And while I was there, I asked the ladies, and this is a compliment to all of you, all the ladies and men that deal with this. I finally said, okay, how did my 50 make out? Because I know they got their 50 and they were happy with that. They laughed at me. Why did they laugh at me? 300 people volunteered for that service. They needed help. I would have never picked that out. I forgot about the local PD, the local fire, the local EMS. I was only concerned about my own people. I forgot about my people in the lab who processed the film, processed all the videotapes, processed all the audio tapes. This is a cancer that grows real fast. And we found some of our people at night when we weren't answering their radio, they were parked next to the child's grave that they had been a family liaison for.
Thanks, Dan. Kevin, you want to talk about the impact on your staff and yourself?
It's very similar to exactly what you're talking about. You know, we didn't do a very good job of this initially. I said early on we didn't have a great victim-centered approach, but you know, it's only been, I would say, in maybe the last decade or so that anybody really cared about how it affected the first responders. You know, when I got hired on, if you saw something that was traumatic, it was like, hey, put it where it belongs, kid, get you back to work. And if you showed emotion, that was weakness. And so, you know, there's a lot has come out of that. I mean, I started, though, I learned very quickly that we needed to go in and have doctors that were good with PTSD, that were good with trauma to go in. And our event was so large, what we did was we actually started grouping different people together that had similar situations. So those 50 plus officers that were actually at the concert with the sergeants and lieutenants that were working the concert had a uniquely different perspective about what happened that day than, say, the crime scene analyst, the dispatchers, the responding officers. You know, there's two of them that I really didn't pay any attention to, and one of those was a deputy chief from the fire department that had worked in our fusion center for years to help work alongside to bridge the gaps between the police and the fire departments. And he was out of town, and he was out of town in Florida when this event happened. And when he flew back, it was pretty much done. And he couldn't live with himself after that and retired. And he moved up to the Pacific Northwest because he had this sort of survivor's guilt that comes around it. And so we've been working to make sure that he gets taken care of as well. You know, the challenge that you have there, and you know, I forced my executive staff to go in and have conversations around it. And I'm sure you have the same experience that I did. Is, look, there's also this weird thing that when you're in charge, I lost 58 people on my watch. And I have to give it to Mary. I don't know if you probably don't even remember this, Mary, but I had given this presentation at one point, and at dinner that night later on, you came up and found me and patted my hand, and you said a lot of nice things to me that I took for a long time. But one of the most important parts of that you told me was that, you know, this will manifest itself in your officers 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, and in the case of New York City, 20 years later. And so that had a really big impact on me. And one of the things that I campaigned on, and now that I'm going to be the sheriff, is I'm creating what I call a wellness bureau at Metro. I actually have to give my wife, Kelly, who's sitting right there, the credit for coming up with this idea, because she was also a deputy chief at Metro. And the Wellness Bureau is going to focus on the heart, mind, body, and soul of our police officers. We're going to give them EMDR therapy, and we're going to give them so much more, because what we don't think about, we can think of those singular instances of trauma, a 9/11, a 1 October, whatever it is that we get exposed to, but we forget about the cumulative trauma. We forget about the hundreds of homicide scenes that I've been on, the hundreds of baby rapes that I've been on, the hundreds of robberies where people were beat to hell. We forget about all that, and we don't care enough about it because we just didn't, and we didn't know, but now we know. So I'm going to create that, and we're going to take care of our police officers in a way that we've never taken care of them before, because I believe if we do that, they're going to take care of our community in a way they've never taken care of it before. But I have to tell you one last story about that, because, you know, as leaders, most of us, we don't pay a whole lot of attention to ourselves. And I had a friend that was retiring right after this in December, and my wife and I my wife was a deputy chief at Metro. I don't remember if I said that or not. So she worked it the same way. We have 5 children. And we decided, I returned over one day in the month of November and looked at each other, and both of us admitted that we had no recollection of the entire month of October because of the long shifts and the trauma and all of those things. And so my friend says, hey, I'm going to retire. I'm going to go to Hawaii. We want you to come to Hawaii with us. So in January of that year, we decided we were going to go to Hawaii. And my wife and I were going to give ourselves a break from the kids. I think it was one of the first times we'd ever done that. So in true Irish fashion, my wife and I get on a plane. We fly to Honolulu, and then we're going to go to Maui. And I don't know if you all remember this period of time where the United States was having some conflict with intercontinental ballistic missiles being launched from North Korea. So we literally land in Honolulu. The plane is pulling up to the gate. I get up, I stand up, I turn my phone on, and I'm a little hard of hearing. So my wife was sitting down here, and you get that emergency alert. And so I got the emergency alert, and it said, ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. So I just went through that trauma, and now I'm thinking, for 45 minutes we thought we were going to die. Now I have some other really funny things that I could tell you about that that are not appropriate for this room, but my wife said no, I'll just leave it at that. But anyway, so after that I did what most of us do is I went to Costco and I went and saw Dr. Bourbon and Dr. Scotch, and I had a really nice week after that. So, but that's where that came from.
Thanks, Kevin. So Dean, I know that you've also dealt with these kinds of issues in the UK, and there's maybe some academic studies that you're aware of.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at our kind of focus with the response, the investigation, you know, we get absolutely kind of drowned in relation to the investigation, and we. A bit similar to you, Kevin, actually, you know, we don't focus on our own people. You know, if you look at the previous panel with Sue, and yes, we've got the obvious victims here and now, those that were actually caught up in the attacks. But if I just come back to whether in fact it's leaders or our people, we did very little at all. And there is a bit of a stigma, I suppose, you know, if I listen to what's just been said here, that there is a stigma actually putting your hand up and saying, I need some help, I need some support. Because as cops, let's be honest, we don't really do it because of all the issues that, you know, we've just heard about. So we did a bit of kind of academic work a couple of years after the attacks in 2017. So if you take the fact that I've said, you know, 5 attacks in 1 year, 4 of those were in London, actually you've got a lot of the same cops, that cumulative effect of PTSD, actually the same cops either dealing, first responders or investigators dealing with each of those. And we didn't really recognise that. And actually, when we look back now, very few people either sought help, sought support. You know, we've got something called occupational health, where you can go to an outside provider and actually seek support, therapy, and get medical assistance. Very few people did that whatsoever. So we did a bit of academic research, reached out to all of those first responders, reached out to all of those investigators that dealt with some of those incidents. And actually, amazingly, we found 80% of them had suffered with PTSD. 80%. Now, that's pretty shocking when actually nobody got some, you know, nobody actually reached out for any support. And if you look at those 80%, we then asked them, well, how did you get support then? And they actually focused on two key areas. One was they went to their family, so husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever it may well be. And the second one was they went to their kind of team. So getting that kind of ethos of the kind of team spirit. Nobody actually went and got any proper support. So if you come back to your family and you come back to, you know, your team or your supervisors, you then pose a question around, are they really trained to give support, you know, professional support in the way that they can? No, they're not. So there's a whole raft of issues that came out of that. And coming back to the academic research, we're still working through some of those recommendations now. So listening to Kevin and your well-being, you know, kind of plan for when you arrive and land properly in Las Vegas, I think is a fantastic idea.
Great, thanks. Something else that we also had talked about is, and this theme of building trust, and all of you had mentioned the idea of conspiracy theorists out there. So you, as you go through in your leadership of these individual events, how do you try to deal with the need for information, the lack of information, and then that void being filled with conspiracy theorists?
Do you want me to go first? So I suppose, you know, that takes us down the communication road, doesn't it? You know, so we don't have communications to the public. And again, if I come back to almost, you know, John Boucher's kind of Canova presentation this morning, that we quite often, if you go back a number of years now, we had this kind of mentality of counter-terrorism, national security. We don't tell anybody anything. You know, John, coming back to the RUC and PSNI, a complete lockdown of information. And of course, we've had to change over the years, and if I come back to our experiences in 2017, we completely changed and went on the front foot. So we actually went really open, really transparent with the public. So as soon as an incident happened, bearing in mind, you know, my example at Westminster, the first challenge you've got is to try and understand what actually are you dealing with. Is it an act of terrorism? Is it something else? But as soon as you've got that clarity, the first thing we're going to do is actually go out as cops and talk to the media, talk to the public, get the messaging out there of what's happened. Quite clearly, we're not going to give the details of the investigation at that stage, but the key thing then is also giving protective security advice. So to the public, what are they going to do? Keep themselves safe. So there's a messaging piece to the public, and you really need to be proactive and go on the front foot around that. There's then a messaging piece internally with your staff, because again, they're going to need to know what to do. And you know, if I look at the UK, if we have an incident in any part of the UK, one of the things we've now set up is a network of kind of communicators to our heads, you know, our heads of investigations and our heads of media, to make sure we're getting one consistent message out across the country, which then, whether in fact it's communities, whether in fact it's people talking to the media, the same message is going out in relation to what's happened. We've then got messaging and communications into our government, into our governmental system, to make sure that the various parts of government are responding in an appropriate manner. And of course, the key thing also, you know, if you look at leadership, is your role, your resilience, and how you're managing and how you fit into that big machine.
I think from our perspective, probably the single most important piece of advice I could give to anybody who's listening is that the media has this voracious appetite for information. And that's understandable. And it starts with your local media, it moves to your national media, and then it moves to your international media. And they all have different resources and capabilities. But you know, we gave a timeline because we thought it was the right thing to do. People wanted to know how long it took for us to get from the event up across the street, up 32 floors and into the room. We had all of that information, but what we had conflicting information. So our CAD data had one time, you know, 10/12.34, and then the radio transmissions had a little bit different. The body-worn cameras had a little bit different. The security dispatch logs had a little bit different. So every time we would go out and provide an update to the timeline, it looked like we were lying to them. That's what people perceived, is that we were lying to them. We were trying to, and I thought we did a pretty decent job of explaining why we were updating it, but these kooks out there, and I mean, you dealt with one of the very worst, but I mean, I can't tell you how many. It's a CIA operation. It's a Metro cover-up. It's, you know, everything in the whole wide world. These kooks are out there and they're talking about it, and it hurts the victims and it hurts the families. Look, there's a ton of personal attacks towards me and the current sheriff about all of it. That nobody really cares about those things, but it's harming victims. And so, as law enforcement leaders, if we don't give enough attention to what it is that we communicate and how it is that we communicate it, we're actually causing further victimization as we move forward. Because what this guy did in your case, I don't even like to say his name, but that victimization people are living with today, and it's the same in my case. The last piece on communication I just want to say is it's really important for whoever it is that's going to go out I think most appropriate is head of agency if you can make it happen, but you got to give that message that there's no longer a threat. Because if that's the case, when you get to that point, they need to hear it from that trusted individual that there is no longer a threat. Because people, you don't realize it because they're not there, but they are living in fear while they're in their homes until that moment comes from the head of the law enforcement organization.
We had those same issues. I like the idea that we did the first day news conferences every 2 hours. Thank you, General Schwarzkopf, for that lesson. And that kept the media here for the news conference, only gave them a short time to come back, and they'd have to be again. So they didn't get to do a lot of work in between. That was a little bit of managing the puppets on the end of your strings. So that worked for us for the first couple of days. And then we started getting more requests. But again, keeping that one person, and you can't expect them to work 24/7. Well, Paul will be here at this time, Paul will be here at this time, meaning Lieutenant Vance. So we managed it that way, and it seemed to work pretty well with us. But I can tell you the secret was, every time we had one of those news conferences, myself, the PIO, and two majors would get together as to what we were going to say, and it was what Paul was going to say. We would go over that, and the two majors then took that information and they got it to all the family liaison officers, so they informed the families first. That was just a way that they didn't have to hear about their little one from the media. That seemed to work very well for us. Being that it was new, we had funerals on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. The prior Saturday and Sunday, I took a lot of heat from the governor because I had way too many resources committed to this effort, and he bugged me 2 days, and then I told him, don't talk to me anymore. I had, if you needed a new colonel, go find one. It was that kind of a conversation. Well, he started to go on funerals on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Guess what he did in front of everybody on the media? He took credit for putting all those troopers out there with the people. So I guess that was the best compliment I was going to get.
That is. Okay, we've got 3 minutes left. Is there anything else that you got? I know you have so much to share, and we have limited time, but is there anything you'd like to leave this audience with to help them to be better prepared for these types of tragedies?
I guess mine would be as to share the knowledge. I've done this presentation a lot over the years, privately when I was retired, and now that I have a sponsor, it's much easier. But one of the things that proved to me that this was worth doing is I had done a presentation like this in Rhode Island. And at one point in time, I got a call late in the day from the colonel in Rhode Island who said to me, I need your help. He says, I need one of those people, those EMDR people for my son. I says, for your son? And his son's a trooper. And I said, is he okay? He goes, no. And I says, what's the matter? He just left Las Vegas. He's on the plane with his son, another trooper, and their two girlfriends, and they're on their way back to Bradley Airport. And he says, I could tell by his voice that he's in trouble. And he's the dad, but yet he's the colonel. But reach out and let people know. Like, you didn't know that, I'm sure, but that's exactly where he was. He was out there in that concert, and the guy he was working on died in his arms. So he was in trouble, and rightfully so. The more people that know about what you do and how you do it, that it's out there. I didn't know, and I should have. But again, it wasn't out like it is today 10 years ago.
I guess the only thing I would add to that is that, I've watched a lot of law enforcement organizations, fire organizations, do their reviews of these types of incidents. I've seen presentations on just about everything. Obviously, a lot of this through LinkedIn, one of the most valuable organizations I've ever been part of, just exceptional people in it. But I would encourage you to go to lvmpd.com, which stands for Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department.com. There is a 1 October review that's we did there. There were 3 reviews done. One was FEMA, one was fire, and then we did one. Our organization has been very unique in holding ourselves accountable. I think if I recall correctly, there's 93, is that right, Kelly? 93 recommendations in that document. There's so much you and your organizations can learn by reading that document, and you'll see that we're very, very critical of what it is that we did and how it is that we did it. And the purpose of that is so that we all get better, so that the next time Newtown happens, the next time 1 October happens in your city and your leaders, wherever it is, or your country, that you and your folks are better prepared to deal with that. And I would encourage you to look at that.
I suppose from my point of view, I'll just finish on, bear in mind we've got the linked programme joining us this afternoon. You've got senior leaders there from across the Five Eyes. Everything you've just heard, the key thing for me is look after yourself. If you're the leader in a command and control position as we have been, then your teams are going to be looking for you. You need to be calm. You need to be collected. And the key thing is you're the key decision maker. And if you're in a bit of a mess and you're not looking after yourself, and if you haven't got your own resilience, actually, what good are you then actually in that command position? So the key thing is look after yourself. With any of these incidents, they're pretty traumatic. They're very demanding. You're going to be working horrendous hours. You're going to be eating complete and utter rubbish. You're not going to be getting much sleep. I'm probably not selling a great picture here, am I? But the key thing is that you're in charge at the end of the day, and if you don't look after yourself, then the rest of the operation, the rest of the response is going to fail as well.